So welcome to today's CPD webinar on climate risk assessments and resilience planning for business. In terms of what you'll learn from today, we hope you'll go away with an understanding of what a climate risk assessment and resilience plan are. You'll be able to identify key global frameworks and standards driving climate risk assessments, and then understand which services can support risk and resilience planning and a high-level overview of the process, and understand why climate risk and resilience plans are important to companies who might need them the most. And then finally, learn how these services can support the journey towards a more resilient future with an example climate risk assessment application. So we have our two wonderful speakers here today. With us, we have Dr. Tara Garrity, who is our Senior Scientist and Biodiversity Lead at Tunley. And we also have the wonderful Emily Alexander, who is our Senior Associate Scientist at Tunley.
So we're going to get started with talking about a changing climate and how that impacts all of us. And you've likely already seen this in your own organizations, that climate change is really no longer theoretical or further down the line. We're starting to see these impacts changing in our day-to-day life. Ultimately, the goal is not to just understand climate change, but to actively plan for it so that operations, supply chains, and revenue streams remain stable into the future. And our goal at Tunley Environmental is to help companies or organizations limit their risk to climate change and be prepared for a shifting climate. The next question we ask ourselves is, how does climate change impact business? And how does this actually translate into business impacts? So first we have physical impacts, which are things like flooding, storms, extreme heat, or that directly damage assets or infrastructure. We then have operational impacts, which could impact downtime, supply chain disruption, or reduce productivity. Then that flows into financial impacts and increased maintenance, insurance premiums, and capital investment. And finally, we have regulatory and market pressures. So that's increasing of expectations from investors, customers, and governments. And the key takeaway here is that climate risk is not isolated. It cascades across the entire business. So with that, we want to ask ourselves, what is climate risk and what is climate resilience? And it's important to define these two key terms. So risk tells us exactly what could go wrong, while resiliency tells us how well we can deal with it. And the goal is to move from understanding risk to actively building that resiliency. So what types of risk are there in terms of climate? There are two main categories of climate risk, and the first, again, is the physical risk, which is what people most commonly think of. So that's direct impacts from weather and climate, and it can include acute risk, so something like storms or floods, or it could include chronic risks like long-term temperature increases or changing rainfall patterns over a long period of time. The second category is something kind of novel and new in terms of climate risk, and this is transition risk. It comes from a shift from how we used to operate to a low carbon economy. And it includes things like policy and regulation changes, technological shifts, and market expectations, as well as reputational pressures. So even if a site isn't directly physically impacted, organizations are still exposed through the broader economic transition. Now, when we talk about physical risks, we're really talking about specific hazards. Common examples include flooding, storms and high winds, heat waves and cold spells, droughts, wildfires, sea level rise. And what's important to really consider is that no two sites are the same. Each location has a unique risk profile based on its environment, infrastructure, and business operations. So the question really becomes, which of these hazards pose the greatest threat to your organization? Now, what we're going to talk about now is we're going to talk through a few different standards and regulations and give some guidance on that. And as we know, climate is becoming increasingly embedded into regulation and reporting requirements. There's a growing number of standards and frameworks that organizations need to align with. These frameworks aren't just about compliance, they're shaping how business identify, assess, and manage their own climate risk. And importantly, they're driving consistency and comparability across all industries. So the first one we're going to talk about is a grouping of ISO. There we go. So ISO 14090's grouping. The first one, 14090, focuses on climate adaptation and principles and planning. There's the next one, which is 14091, underpins risk and vulnerability, and essentially how we identify and score risk. Whilst the next one builds on this to guide adaptation planning, particularly at a local or community level. And together, these standards form a structured science-based approach to climate risk and resiliency, and they ensure that assessments are robust, credible, and aligned with the best global practice. So the next standard we're going to talk about, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD. And under CSRD, there is something called ESRS E1, in which companies are required to disclose climate risks and opportunities, emissions across scope 1, 2, and 3, transition plans, and adaptation measures. And a key component within this regulation and guideline for climate change is a double materiality, which is understanding both the impact your business has on climate and the impact climate has on your business. And it's a major shift in how climate is embedded directly into governance, strategy, and financial decision making. And finally, the last regulation or standard guideline we're going to talk about is Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD. And this framework helps organizations structure how they think about and report climate risk. And it's built around 4 pillars. So there's governance, strategy, risk management, and metric and targets. And what's important here is the climate risk assessment directly feeds into particularly the strategy and the risk management sections. And increasingly, regulators are moving towards making this type of disclosure mandatory. You'll see at the last bullet point there that California SB 261 requires this report for select companies. And we do suspect that it will be more broadly required as time goes on. So essentially, climate is no longer just a sustainability topic. It's now firmly a core business and financial issue.
Thanks, Sarah. On this slide, I'm going to give an overview of what we have done at Tunley Environmental to essentially develop a methodology around our climate service. And hopefully this methodology and these different phases and steps in this assessment can either inspire your organization to develop or work on a climate risk assessment for yourself, or it can help you to essentially start that process of thinking through what kind of data might we need to collect and what might it look like to prepare for working with an organization like Tunley or others to actually complete a climate risk assessment. As Tara said, we have developed our approach based on the ISO 14090 and 91. We've decided to split up our climate risk assessment and the climate resilience plan into 2 separate phases. Essentially, the reason here is you need to understand your climate risk in order to develop a plan to embed resilience into your system or into your site. So within the climate risk assessment, the first piece, as in any big project like this, is essentially like what falls into the scope of your project that might be at risk for climate change. So that's step 1. The next piece is doing a site vulnerability assessment. This can look a few different ways. Essentially how we've been doing it is it's important just to have a conversation about how old might the infrastructure be, how close in proximity is your a building or transportation network, some other critical piece of infrastructure, how close does that sit to perhaps the ocean or a river. So there might be some extra vulnerability based on the proximity to a potential hazard. Once you understand the vulnerability of your site, it's important to then identify those potential climate hazards that your site could be at risk for. I also want to, once you've identified the boundary of the site and know the vulnerability and have those hazards identified, from there we can then analyze those climate hazards based on the specific location of your site. There's two different sets of data that we would look for. The first is I would look at specific historic climate data of a given location to understand and establish a baseline for example, what is the average temperature in this region? How many hot days above like a high threshold, say 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 degrees Celsius? Essentially looking at historic data to have an understanding of what is my baseline climate. And then we would compare that to different climate projections into the future. And essentially this analysis allows us to see how likely and what the like severity of change is in specific climate drivers like temperature, precipitation, risk of storms, etc. Once we've done this analysis, we are then able to define and assign a score to each hazard. And from there, we're able to prioritize the different risks that we have by hazard. So we can then identify what of these climate hazards are at greatest risk to our site based on the site context and also the historical and projected climate data, if that makes sense. So once we've gotten to this final step, which is this prioritization of climate risk, then we're able to work with the site to enter into phase 2. And in the development of this climate resilience plan, we would work with the site manager to essentially identify different strategies to minimize risk to those highest ranking hazards. And the goal here is to make sure that we're working with the people who are on the ground at the sites who really intimately know what the site, essentially how it has experienced damage in the past, or potentially like the weak points, so that they can help craft a resilience plan that makes sense for their site based on potential weaknesses, but also makes sense based on the desire of, changing and adding in different resilience strategies at the given site to make sure that it fits in well with the operational capacity of the site. So I just want to reiterate that this is a really collaborative approach with the scientists who are doing the climate analysis and also those people who are working on the site and have a deep understanding of that site as well. So this collaboration and iterative approach is really important as well. So now that you guys have an overview of the methodology of a climate risk assessment, you might be asking, how do you actually score that climate risk piece? And I want to say that what we're trying to do is essentially we are trying to take this qualitative piece and turn it into a quantitative approach so that we can have a clearer understanding of what these greatest risks are. Our team has developed what we're calling the climate risk equation. So each hazard that we've identified, each of those specific hazards will be assigned a specific risk score based on these 3 different metrics. So exposure, the question that we're asking here is the site exposed to a specific climate hazard or not? When we're looking at vulnerability, we're asking, is the site vulnerable to damage if it's exposed to a hazard? And finally, in the modeling of each climate hazard, we're trying to understand what is the likelihood or the probability of occurrence of a given hazard at the specific location. And so this piece, we're doing the modeling, the data analysis to understand how over time, what is the this change in probability that a hazard will happen based on projected climate models. What comes out of the climate risk assessment? Essentially, we're wanting to identify the top climate risks, and each of these climate hazards are going to be scored from 1, which means relatively none to low risk, and 25 being the highest risk, highest severity as far as the scoring goes. And so each hazard will be scored within this range. I'm going to break down this results table for you guys. In a results table, what you can see on the left column, these are the hazards that our team of scientists has identified with the site manager. This list could look very different for your site. If you were someone who is located on the ocean, probably sea level rise would be on this, as well as perhaps hurricanes, other things like this. Looking over to the next 2 columns, you'll notice we have at the top SSP 2-4.5 and SSP 5-8.5. These are just some technical labelings, but essentially it's best practice based on the ISO standards to look at multiple emission scenarios. And so what we have decided to do at Tunley is look at a medium emission scenario and a high or worst case emission scenario. And it's important to kind of have a conservative approach as well to understand what is the potential for greatest risk if globally we end up in a high emission scenario or a high amount of carbon dioxide emitted. And the next thing that you'll see is we look at different timescales. The risk levels are going to be different in the short term as compared to a more medium and long-term risk, because if we look at the results, you can see that the lower numbers are more color-coded in like a yellowish green color, and the greater the risk, the closer to red it is, just as a visual. So you'll see on this, in this specific example, the greatest risk that we've identified for this specific site is flash flooding. And that's true in both the medium and the high emission scenario, but you'll see that in the high emission scenario, it has a greater risk score because the models were showing essentially higher potential for flooding events, extreme precipitation, etc. And so this is a typical thing that we see when we're looking at these sort of results, is that risk often increases with a higher emission scenario and also with longer timescales. It's also important to note that these models, there's greater uncertainty, as you get closer to the end of the century, as compared to more of these like short-term pieces. So once we have this results, from here we would essentially take these results to the client and partner with them to develop a resilience plan. And we would target specifically these higher risk areas within that resilience plan. Essentially give a case for why might companies want to integrate climate risk into their planning, into their business models. There are a lot of benefits for businesses to integrate climate risk into their systems. The first is it can reduce your risk and mitigate exposure or disruptions to your business. It can have some impacts on reputation and brand based on what do customers or business partners, what do they think about the ways that you're integrating climate risk into your system. It could increase some market opportunities or expand into new markets, especially we see this requirements, especially in Europe and the UK. Some of those markets are requiring things like CSRD. So there really is a business case and opportunity to just expand into different markets if you're thinking about climate risk more proactively. Integrates operational resilience. There's opportunities to integrate nature-based solutions into your business. There's also a really big potential for capital, either bringing in new capital or protecting against future loss. It's important to kind of think about this as like a cost benefit sort of analysis, and essentially any money that you might invest into a resilience plan, a resilience strategy on your site, you might not see it back as a direct profit, but the way that you will have capital benefit essentially is that the goal is that in the future, it's protecting your organization from some kind of loss, or hopefully would mitigate damage or minimize downtime. So that's also an important piece to consider. And then the last thing is regulatory readiness. We see that there's a lot of regulations coming down the line, and being proactive in this can really help prepare your business to do well in the marketplace. So now that you guys have an overview of the methodology and kind of an idea of how this sort of assessment plays out from a higher level methodology standpoint, I want to give you guys a couple examples and talk through what might this look like in real time or applied to a real scenario. So I want everyone to take a second and look at this. This is an image of potentially what a port could look like. Essentially, it's a transportation hub. And so take a second to think about what are some assets or pieces of critical infrastructure that exist on this site. Just want to give you guys, first, I would be drawn to the different transportation pieces. So your vessels are really important. Thinking about the waterway and the roadways, making sure that those are in good shape and that you're able to keep trucks on the road, you're able to keep vessels unloading. There's also a lot of equipment on site that you probably can see. So these cranes for unloading, there's maybe forklifts to move around boxes and other products that were delivered, to move them into trucks to then send them off to another site. There's also a lot of warehousing and other office buildings, potentially power generation on site, some co-located industrial facilities. So all of these are different assets or different pieces of critical infrastructure that could be negatively affected by essentially by a climate event if something happens. Yeah, and just a reminder, it's important to make sure that in this data collection process, that we're making sure that we're involving the right people who have either worked here for a long time and have seen some potential like changes over time, or maybe there's been some kind of storm or flooding event that they've experienced and it's documented and they can share that information with us. But yeah, the people who work on the site are the expert of the site. I want to talk through some thoughts on, in this specific example of the port, what might our results and our resilience suggestions look like. A top risk at a port is flooding and extreme rainfall. These things could have impacts on water levels, could cause flooding on site. These top two risks essentially are going to be what we prioritize most of the resilience measures for. So the first suggestion that I would have would be, how can we add flooding protection and upgrade some infrastructure to essentially protect against floods? So some of these things could look like adding extra pumps or drainage systems to help divert water in a better way. Another thing is looking at nature-based solutions. This is something I think it's gaining a lot more traction in the climate and like nature space. Nature really does a good job of showing us how we can design simple systems to essentially make sure that we're like not causing more damage. So I think it's really helpful to look to nature as a model. The last piece that I want to note is it's important to make sure that there's redundancy into the system, ensuring that any critical operation has an alternative option in the case of damage. So this could look like multiple entry points into a site. This could look like backup power in the case of damage to utility lines, but just ensuring that there is added redundancy into the system so that you're not in a tough spot if damage occurs and your operations have to shut down. So the next example I'm going to walk through is an outline of the TCFD style reporting, just to give an overview of how might you think about developing or aligning with TCFD or CSRD reporting styles. The governance piece is a process of disclosing your organization's governance and decision-making around climate-related risks and opportunities. And this would look like understanding the board or management's oversight or decision-making on these topics. The strategy piece is a way of essentially understanding those physical and the transition climate risks. And so what you would be able to do here is to disclose are those top risks in those two categories of physical and transition risks. And in this bucket, you would also do a physical climate risk assessment, like I talked about as in Tenley's methodology, that would be integrated into this report in the strategy section. The risk management piece is disclosing how the organization as a whole essentially identifies these risks, but also assesses and manages these different climate-related risks. So this piece is kind of tied into governance, but instead of just the decision-making piece that is discussed in the governance section, this risk management section essentially talks about how, as an organization, will you enact or carry out mitigating those different physical and transition risks. And finally, this metrics and target section is also an important opportunity to disclose any other sustainability or ESG related work that your organization does. So this might look like disclosing your scopes 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. It might look like noting targets that you have, and essentially what is your organization doing as a whole to work on understanding your climate risks and opportunities. But yeah, I wanted to thank you guys for your time.